Turn around. Hands behind your back. You are under arrest. Come with me.
The officer believed the badge gave him absolute control, that whatever he decided in that moment would never be questioned. What he couldn't see was that the teenager he chose to assert power over was connected to a system far more dangerous than public outrage, one that wouldn't confront him, warn him, or intervene, only document everything and wait. By the time the officer realized something was wrong, the damage wasn't emotional anymore. It was procedural, and procedures don't forget. The neighborhood looked like hundreds of others across America, a place where nothing ever made the evening news. Streets were clean but worn, lawns trimmed unevenly, porches lit by soft yellow bulbs as families settled into their nightly routines. It was the kind of environment where police presence was common enough to feel normal, yet heavy enough to remind residents who truly held control. On the surface, everything felt calm, almost uneventful, which made what followed even more jarring. The patrol vehicle slowed as it entered the block, its presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. The officer did not rush or appear alarmed, but there was an unmistakable confidence in how he moved, as if the street already belonged to him. His posture carried the certainty of someone accustomed to compliance, someone rarely questioned and never challenged. The uniform, crisp and authoritative, acted as both symbol and shield, communicating power long before a word was ever spoken. The teenager stood out, not because he was doing anything wrong, but because he was young and visible. He wasn't hiding, running, or resisting. His body language suggested uncertainty rather than defiance, a quiet awareness that attention had turned toward him for reasons he didn't fully understand. Despite this, scrutiny came immediately. The officer's gaze lingered longer than necessary, scanning for justification instead of context, as if the decision had already been made before any assessment occurred. The badge played a silent yet dominant role in the encounter. It wasn't presented as a symbol of service or protection, but as an emblem of control. Every movement by the officer reinforced the idea that authority didn't need explanation. The uniform communicated that compliance was expected, not earned, and that questioning the process itself could be seen as a challenge. Responsibility took a back seat to dominance, and the imbalance was unmistakable. Instead of slowing the situation down, the officer relied on command presence alone. De-escalation techniques that were designed for moments like this were ignored, replaced by firm directives delivered without dialogue or clarification. There was no attempt to reduce tension, only an assumption that control would be achieved through authority alone. The choice to bypass calmer alternatives was subtle but significant, marking the first clear departure from proper procedure. Small procedural missteps began stacking quietly, almost invisibly. Identification was demanded without explanation. Instructions were issued without cause being clearly stated. Each step, taken individually, could have been dismissed as routine, but together they formed a pattern of overreach. These were not dramatic violations, but quiet ones, the kind that often go unnoticed until examined later under harsher light. What stood out most was how little evidence guided the officer's actions. Decisions were made based on perception rather than facts, on assumption rather than verification. The teenager's presence was treated as justification enough, his age and appearance filling in gaps where evidence should have been. Authority moved faster than reason, confident that it would not be required to explain itself. Bystanders noticed the shift, even if they couldn't articulate it. Conversations on porches paused. Windows became viewing points. The scene drew attention not because of chaos, but because of tension. Everyone could sense that something had tilted off balance, that the encounter had crossed from routine into something heavier, something harder to ignore. The officer seemed unaware of how exposed the moment had become. Standing in open view, he continued forward with the confidence that came from years of unchecked discretion. The public setting did not slow him down. It reinforced his belief that what he was doing would be accepted as standard. The badge, after all, had always been enough before. The officer makes a decision that cannot be undone, and it happens in full view of the public. The badge did not protect the innocent that night. It protected a belief. The officer's mindset had been shaped long before this encounter ever occurred. Years of repetition, shortcuts, and unchallenged decisions had trained him to rely on instinct over process. What he saw was rarely questioned, and what he believed was rarely tested. In his world, patterns mattered more than individuals, and assumptions often replaced investigation. The badge reinforced this thinking, not as a reminder of responsibility, but as validation that his judgments were enough. The teenager standing before him was no longer viewed as a person with context, history, or rights. He became a perceived risk, a category rather than a citizen. Age did not signal youth or vulnerability in the officer's assessment, it signaled unpredictability. Presence alone became suspicious, and silence was interpreted not as compliance, but as potential resistance. The transformation was quiet but complete, turning a human being into a problem that needed control. Bias did not appear loudly or emotionally. It worked structurally, embedded in how the situation was framed from the start. Race and age were not acknowledged openly, yet they influenced every decision made. The officer did not need to articulate these biases because the system around him had already normalized them. Training language, informal culture, and past reinforcement all worked together to make these assumptions feel procedural rather than personal. Officer safety became the unspoken justification for every premature move. It was a phrase powerful enough to end questions and override restraint. Any action taken under its banner was automatically shielded from scrutiny, even when no clear threat existed. The concept, meant to protect lives, was stretched into a tool that excused control before cause. In that space, safety was prioritized over fairness and caution over rights. The broader system played its part quietly. Aggressive discretion had long been tolerated, even rewarded, when it produced compliance without complaint. Supervisors valued outcomes over methods, and complaints were rare enough to dismiss as anomalies. This environment taught officers that pushing boundaries carried little risk, especially when no one immediately objected. The absence of resistance was often mistaken for approval. Bystanders, though present, remained silent. Some watched from a distance, unsure whether intervention would help or worsen the situation. Others had learned through experience that involvement often came with consequences. Their silence unintentionally reinforced authority, creating a space where the officer's actions went unchallenged. The lack of immediate opposition strengthened the belief that everything unfolding was acceptable. The badge thrived in this silence. It stood as a visual reminder of power that did not need consensus. The officer's confidence grew, fed by the familiar rhythm of compliance and observation without interruption. Each moment without resistance confirmed his assumptions, making reconsideration feel unnecessary. The encounter continued along a path shaped not by evidence, but by expectation. What the officer failed to recognize was how fragile this sense of control truly was. Systems that rely on assumption leave behind traces, small inconsistencies that only become visible later. Procedures skipped in the moment often resurface in review, detached from the urgency that once justified them. Confidence, when unsupported by process, has a way of exposing itself over time. As the encounter moved forward, one small step went undocumented correctly. It seemed insignificant in the moment, buried beneath routine and repetition. The officer did not notice it, nor did he believe it mattered. But records have a memory that authority cannot erase, and this detail would not disappear. One unnoticed procedural error quietly enters the record. Force was used not because it was necessary, but because it was available. The escalation did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. It unfolded in measured steps, each one appearing reasonable in isolation, yet collectively forming a path that no longer resembled judgment. The officer did not shout or rush. Instead, he tightened control through procedure-like actions, increasing pressure without reassessing the situation. Authority moved forward simply because nothing had stopped it yet. There was no clear threat driving these decisions. The teenager remained where he was, compliant in posture and restrained in behavior, Still, the response continued to grow heavier. Instructions became more restrictive, boundaries narrower. What could have been resolved through explanation or verification was now treated as a scenario that demanded immediate dominance. The imbalance was unmistakable. The response far outweighed the circumstances that precede. Edit. With each step, the officer's confidence grew. He spoke and acted as though legality would automatically follow authority, as if the badge itself filled in gaps left by missing justification. The more control he asserted, the less he revisited whether that control was warranted. This confidence was not rooted in clarity, but in habit, the expectation that his decisions would never need to be defended beyond the moment they were made. The teenager's vulnerability became more apparent as options quietly disappeared. His future, though not discussed, hovered in the background of every decision. A single incident could echo through school records, employment prospects, and personal identity. None of that factored into the officer's calculations. The system rarely accounts for long-term impact in real time, especially when speed and authority are prioritized over consequence. The public nature of the encounter amplified everything. People nearby were no longer just witnesses, they were silent participants in a moment that now carried social weight. Phones remained lowered, conversations hushed. Everyone sensed the gravity without fully understanding it. The officer, aware of the attention yet unbothered by it, seemed reassured by the familiarity of being observed without being challenged. The badge operated as assumed immunity. It suggested that whatever unfolded would be interpreted through a lens of trust, not scrutiny. The officer relied on that assumption, believing that authority alone would define the narrative. This belief allowed him to push further without hesitation, convinced that the system would interpret his actions as necessary simply because he was the one taking them. What was missing was judgment. Not policy, not training, not authority, but the deliberate pause that asks whether power should be exercised at all. The officer did not stop to reassess the facts, because escalation had already become the default. Each step made the next feel inevitable, locking the encounter into a trajectory shaped more by momentum than reason. Time slowed in subtle ways. The neighborhood seemed quieter, the air heavier. Even routine sounds felt distant as the situation solidified into something more serious than it needed to be. The officer did not notice this shift, but others did. The teenager certainly did, standing at the center of a process that no longer felt procedural, but personal. What the officer could not see was how documentation would later dissect this moment. Actions taken quickly often leave behind gaps, and gaps invite questions. The confidence that fueled the escalation blinded him to the importance of precision. In relying on authority alone, he overlooked the details that transform actions into defensible decisions. Elsewhere, far from the street and its quiet tension, information began to move. A call was made, a detail mentioned, a concern raised by someone who understood systems better than scenes. This person did not need to witness the event to recognize its implications. Experience filled in the blanks that authority had ignored. The encounter continued, still outwardly controlled, still framed as routine. Yet its trajectory had already shifted beyond the officer's awareness. What felt contained on the street was beginning to expand beyond it, entering spaces where badges held less weight than records and assumptions carried consequences. Someone far removed from the scene becomes aware of what happened. The teenager was not powerful, but his last name quietly was. The story moved away from the street without warning, leaving behind the tense stillness of the neighborhood and entering a world governed by structure rather than instinct. Miles away, in an environment defined by order and documentation, the teenager's father went about his day with deliberate calm. His life operated on systems, not impulses, and on accountability measured in reports rather than reactions. This was not a man unfamiliar with authority. It was someone who had spent years inside its highest mechanisms. He was disciplined in the way he approached information. Emotion never led his decisions and urgency never replaced verification. When he learned of what had happened, there was no outward display of anger or shock. Instead, there was focus. Experience had taught him that the most effective responses were rarely loud. Power, when used correctly, did not announce itself. It moved quietly, leaving permanent effects without spectacle. His federal authority was not the kind that demanded recognition in public spaces. It did not rely on uniforms visible on the street or commands issued in moments of tension. It existed in oversight, jurisdiction, and long-reaching consequence. This authority was designed to correct systems when they drifted from their purpose, not to dominate individuals in the moment. The difference between these forms of power was vast, though rarely understood by those who relied on the badge alone. Years spent navigating accountability had shaped his understanding of how cases unravel. He knew that the smallest procedural error could carry more weight than the most forceful disposal of control. Oversight bodies did not look for drama. They looked for consistency, accuracy, and adherence to process. Where street authority thrived on immediacy, institutional authority thrived on patience. It waited for facts to align, then acted decisively. The contrast between the two worlds could not have been sharper. On the street, authority had been loud, visible, and unquestioned. It had relied on presence and assumption to assert dominance. In the Father's world, authority was silent and methodical. It did not need compliance in the moment because it commanded consequence over time. One relied on fear of escalation, the other relied on inevitability. Despite the personal nature of the situation, the Father did not center himself in the story. His focus remained on the system, not the individual officer. He understood that framing mattered. Emotional reactions could compromise credibility, while precision strengthened it. This restraint was not weakness. It was strategy informed by years of watching cases succeed or fail based on how they were presented. He reviewed what little information he had with the same rigor he applied to professional matters. Details were noted, timelines considered, and context evaluated. The public nature of the incident immediately stood out, not as a source of outrage, but as a factor of accountability. Visibility often changed how institutions responded, and he knew that awareness could not be undone once it existed. The Father also understood that intervention did not mean confrontation. The goal was not to embarrass or retaliate, but to correct. Justice, in its most effective form, restored balance rather than satisfying anger. Acting carefully ensured that the process would withstand scrutiny, and that outcomes would be rooted in fact rather than perception. This was how systems were meant to work, even if they often failed to do so. There was a moment of pause before he acted, a deliberate space where emotion could have entered but did not. In that pause, he chose the path that aligned with his principles and experience. It was a choice shaped by confidence in process rather than faith in individuals. The system, when engaged properly, had the capacity to correct itself. When he finally moved, it was subtle. No announcements were made, no threats implied. A single step was taken within the framework he understood so well, designed to initiate review rather than provoke resistance. It was an action that appeared insignificant on the surface, yet carried weight far beyond its simplicity. This action did not aim to control the narrative. It allowed the facts to do that work. It trusted that records, procedures, and oversight would speak louder than confrontation ever could. The Father knew that once set in motion, the process would follow its course, unaffected by the noise of the street or the confidence of a badge. A single action is taken that begins a chain reaction. The moment federal oversight enters, local power starts shrinking. The shift was not immediate, but it was undeniable. Inside the department, what had once felt like a routine incident began to take on unfamiliar weight. Reports that were expected to close the matter instead reopened it, drawing attention from desks that rarely questioned street-level decisions. Authority that once flowed downward now hesitated, uncertain of how far its reach truly extended. Internal documentation was the first place the cracks appeared. Written accounts that seemed consistent at a glance began to falter when placed beside digital records. Timelines didn't align cleanly. Descriptions felt vague where they should have been precise. Small omissions previously overlooked now stood out as liabilities. Technology did not argue or speculate. It simply preserved what happened, indifferent to rank or reputation. Supervisors sensed the danger before it was openly discussed. Experience told them when a situation was drifting beyond their control, and this was one of those moments. The mention of federal review alone altered the tone of meetings and memos. Questions were asked more carefully. Words were chosen with caution. Everyone understood that jurisdiction changed everything, and local authority did not carry the same weight once higher oversight entered the picture. The chain of command, once unified, began to fracture into layers of protection. Decisions slowed, guidance became less direct, responsibility subtly shifted upward, as if no one wanted to be the last name attached to a flawed judgment. The confidence that once defined the department's response gave way to defensiveness, not out of guilt but out of uncertainty. At the center of it all, the officer's version of events began to unravel. What had seemed straightforward now required clarification. Statements that relied on assumption could no longer stand without support. Each follow-up question narrowed the space for explanation, forcing inconsistencies into view. The badge no longer simplified the narrative, it complicated it. The department itself began to change posture. What started as reassurance turned into damage control. Legal advisors became more involved. Language shifted from justification to mitigation. The goal was no longer to prove that nothing went wrong, but to limit how much could be proven to have gone wrong. Confidence was replaced by containment, a clear signal that the situation had escalated beyond routine. This transformation was quiet, happening behind closed doors rather than on the street, yet its effects were far-reaching. Decisions were reviewed with fresh scrutiny. Policies once treated as guidelines were now examined as obligations. The system, sensing pressure from above, began correcting itself in ways that felt abrupt to those unaccustomed to oversight. The officer felt the change without fully understanding it. Interactions with supervisors became more formal. Questions grew more detailed. Familiar reassurances disappeared. The space he once occupied comfortably within the system began to feel unstable, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. Authority that once protected him now felt distant, even conditional. What unsettled him most was the realization that the narrative was no longer his to control. Records spoke louder than recollection, and oversight did not rely on trust. It relied on evidence. The confidence that had guided his earlier decisions now worked against him, highlighting where certainty had replaced caution. Outside the department, awareness continued to spread quietly. Information moved through institutional channels rather than public ones, making it more dangerous in its precision. This was not a matter of opinion or outrage, it was a matter of process. And process, once engaged, rarely stopped for individual discomfort. The gravity of federal involvement reshaped priorities. Local authority, once absolute within its domain, now answered to standards beyond its own interpretation. The system that had tolerated aggressive discretion began recalibrating under the weight of accountability. Every step taken earlier without question was now examined for justification. For the officer, the realization came slowly but firmly. What had started as a moment of assumed control had grown into something far larger. The badge no longer guaranteed resolution. The department no longer offered certainty. The process had moved beyond personalities and into permanence. The officer realizes this case is no longer controllable. The officer didn't fall because of force. He fell because of detail. The unraveling did not begin with confrontation or accusation. It began quietly, inside documents that were never meant to tell a story, only to record one. As the case moved deeper into review, paperwork that once felt routine became evidence. Lines that had been skimmed over now demanded precision. Each word mattered, and every omission carried weight. Inconsistencies surfaced slowly, then all at once. Descriptions failed to align with timestamps. Actions were recorded without corresponding justification. What initially looked like minor clerical issues revealed a larger pattern of carelessness. These were not dramatic errors, but they were revealing ones. The system did not interpret them as accidents, it interpreted them as signals. A reconstructed timeline began to form. built not on memory, but on verifiable data. When events were placed in sequence, gaps became impossible to ignore. Decisions appeared earlier than they should have. Justifications arrived after the fact. Authority that once seemed confident now looked rushed. The narrative the officer believed he controlled was quietly rewritten by records that did not bend to interpretation. As the review deepened, prior behavior patterns emerged, not as accusations, but as context. Previous reports showed a tendency toward assumption over verification, a habit of relying on discretion without documentation. None of it had triggered serious consequences before, which only reinforced the belief that such shortcuts were acceptable. Now, those same patterns provided a backdrop that made current inconsistencies harder to dismiss. The legal vulnerability became undeniable. Oversight bodies did not focus on intent, they focused on process. Whether the officer believed he acted correctly mattered less than whether he could prove it. Each unanswered question narrowed the margin for explanation. Each missing detail shifted the burden away from interpretation and toward accountability. The badge, once a shield, began to feel heavy. It no longer simplified the situation, it complicated it. Expectations were higher because of it, and scrutiny sharper. The authority it represented came with obligations that could not be selectively ignored. What once protected the officer now magnified the consequences of his mistakes. Inside the department, the tone shifted again. Discussions moved from defense to preparation. Language became cautious, measured. Legal counsel weighed in more frequently, emphasizing exposure rather than reassurance. The system was no longer asking whether the officer acted reasonably, but whether it could defend the process that allowed it. The officer felt the pressure building, not through confrontation but through distance. Support became procedural rather than personal. Meetings were shorter, more formal. Answers were documented rather than accepted. The environment he once navigated with ease now felt unfamiliar, governed by rules he had grown accustomed to bending. What made the situation irreversible was its clarity. There was no single dramatic revelation, no moment that could be spun or explained away. Instead, there was accumulation. Each small error reinforced the next, creating a structure of exposure that stood on its own. Authority could not dismantle what evidence had assembled. The system's response was methodical. Accountability processes moved forward without spectacle, guided by standards rather than sentiment. The officer's intentions were noted, but they no longer held decisive power. What mattered was the record, and the record told a story that could not be ignored. The transformation of the badge was complete. It no longer represented unquestioned authority but documented responsibility. Every symbol that once commanded compliance now demanded explanation. The officer was no longer protected by what he represented, he was defined by how he used it. As the review reached its conclusion, the outcome became unavoidable. Decisions were finalized not in anger, but in accordance with policy. The process did not seek revenge, only resolution. Yet resolution carried consequences that extended far beyond the moment that started it all. A career-altering decision is placed on record. Justice did not arrive loudly. It arrived permanently. The outcome did not unfold in a courtroom packed with spectators or under flashing lights. Instead, it moved through offices, review panels, and official channels where decisions were made without drama, but with lasting effect. Administrative processes advanced steadily, guided by standards rather than sentiment. Paperwork replaced speculation, and conclusions were drawn from records rather than reactions. This was justice operating the way institutions claimed it always should. Consequences followed a structured path. Internal reviews resulted in formal findings that could not be dismissed as misunderstandings. Policies were cited clearly, outlining where procedure had been ignored or misapplied. These findings triggered disciplinary measures that were corrective by design. The goal was not public punishment, but institutional repair. Accountability was framed as a necessary adjustment meant to restore credibility rather than satisfy outrage. Legal implications were addressed with the same restraint. Oversight ensured that actions aligned with statutory expectations, not personal interpretations. The process moved carefully, ensuring that outcomes would withstand scrutiny. This methodical approach removed emotion from the equation, replacing it with permanence. Decisions made here would not be reversed by public opinion or internal loyalty. For the teenager, the impact extended far beyond the moment that began it all. While the system worked through its corrections, his life continued under the shadow of what had happened. Trust in authority had been altered. Perhaps permanently. The experience reshaped how he viewed institutions meant to protect him, introducing caution where there had once been neutrality. Yet the acknowledgement of error offered something rare, validation without spectacle. Steps were taken to ensure that the incident did not define his future. Records were reviewed, classifications corrected, and safeguards applied to prevent lingering harm. These measures were quiet but significant, aimed at ensuring that a single misuse of power would not echo indefinitely through his life. Justice, in this sense, was restorative, seeking balance rather than victory. The department itself faced consequences that could not be measured in policy changes alone. Reputation suffered as oversight findings circulated within professional networks. Trust, once assumed, now required rebuilding. The incident became a reference point in training discussions and internal evaluations, a reminder of how quickly authority could erode when misused. Damage control could limit exposure, but it could not erase the lesson. Leadership acknowledged the strain without dramatizing it. Statements focused on improvement rather than defense. The department's confidence was tempered by humility, recognizing that unchecked discretion carried risks not just for individuals, but for institutions as a whole. This shift marked a subtle but meaningful change in how authority was discussed internally. Throughout it all, the father remained largely unseen. He did not attend hearings or issue statements. His presence was felt only through the processes he had set in motion. This absence reinforced the nature of his power. It did not need visibility to be effective. It relied on structure, not recognition, and once accountability was secured, it receded back into anonymity. The officer, now facing the weight of consequence, occupied a different position within the system. Authority no longer defined him, compliance with outcome did. The badge still existed, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer a symbol of unchecked discretion, but a reminder of responsibility and limitation. Justice had redefined the balance. What made this resolution enduring was its lack of spectacle. There were no dramatic confrontations or emotional closures. Instead, there was acceptance of outcome and adjustment of course. The system corrected itself not because it was forced to, but because it could no longer justify standing still. This quiet permanence carried more weight than any public display ever could. Yet, not everything had reached its conclusion. One aspect of the process remained open, delayed not by resistance but by procedure. It lingered as a reminder that accountability often unfolds in stages and that finality is rarely immediate. The story, while nearing resolution, had not fully settled. One final outcome still remains unresolved. Authority ended the moment accountability began. The consequences did not arrive as a spectacle. There were no cameras waiting, no public confrontation that marked the end. Instead, the officer's position within the system quietly dissolved. Responsibilities were reassigned, access restricted, authority reduced to formality. The badge remained a physical object, but its power was gone. What once commanded immediate compliance now carried little weight, stripped of the confidence that had depth. In edit, credibility followed the same path. Trust that had been assumed was now measured, and the measure came up short. Within professional circles, the officer's name became associated not with service, but with caution. Future opportunities narrowed, not because of a single moment, but because of what that moment revealed. Careers built on unchecked discretion rarely survive sustained scrutiny, and this one was no exception. The future that once felt secure became uncertain. Advancement stalled, options closed, and the sense of belonging within the institution faded. This was not punishment delivered in anger, but consequence delivered through process. The system did not need to humiliate the officer, it only needed to remove the protections he had taken for granted. Without them, the reality of his choices became unavoidable. Beyond the individual, the institution absorbed the lesson. Policies were revisited with renewed seriousness. Training materials changed tone, emphasizing restraint where confidence once dominated. Leadership understood that authority, when misused, damaged more than reputations. It weakened public trust and invited oversight that could not be controlled. The incident became a case study, a reminder that power without accountability eventually turns inward. For the teenager, the story did not end with the system's correction. His identity, once reduced to a moment of scrutiny, slowly reclaimed its shape. He was no longer defined by an encounter or by someone else's assumptions. Support structures helped redirect the narrative toward his future rather than his past. What lingered was not fear, but awareness, an understanding of how fragile fairness could be. That awareness did not harden him. Instead, it gave him clarity. He learned early what many never do, that systems can fail, but they can also be challenged when approached carefully. His life moved forward, carrying the experience as context rather than limitation. The incident became something he endured, not something that defined him. The federal presence that had influenced the outcome faded quietly back into the background. There were no final statements or visible gestures. Oversight completed its work and withdrew, leaving local institutions to live with the changes. This silence was intentional. True authority did not require recognition once its purpose had been fulfilled. It existed to correct, then disappear. What remained was the truth about misuse of power. It was not dramatic or cinematic in its consequences. It was slow, isolating, and deeply personal. The officer did not lose everything at once, he lost it piece by piece, each loss tied directly to a decision once made without hesitation. Karma, in this form, was procedural. The badge, once treated as immunity, became evidence of responsibility unmet. It served as a reminder that authority was never meant to be personal armor. When worn without restraint, it invited scrutiny rather than respect. The system did not destroy the officer, it simply stopped protecting him. In the end, no one celebrated. Justice did not require applause, it required acknowledgement and adjustment. The system moved forward altered. The people within it reminded that power demanded care. The incident faded from public memory, but its effects endured quietly within policies, careers, and lives redirected. The most unsettling part was what remained unsaid. This case reached oversight because of circumstance, connection, and visibility. Many others did not. The system corrected itself here, but not everywhere. Accountability, while effective, was not universal. It depended on who noticed and who had the means to act. The story ends with an uncomfortable truth. Most misuse of power is never watched closely enough. If this made you think differently about authority, accountability, or how quickly power can cross a line, consider supporting the conversation by liking, sharing, and staying connected to this channel. These stories don't spread on outrage alone. They spread when people decide they're worth paying attention to. If no one had been watching this moment closely enough, do you believe the outcome would have been the same?